Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
When I start thinking about the past, I guess that part of the problem that I see is that many people have trouble coming to terms with the past. For many people, the past is very negative. I think of people who grew up in bad family situations and just as soon forget the whole thing. I think of people who have fights and arguments with friends or acquaintances, associates in the past, and would just as soon never think about that again. So in many ways, for many people, the past is negative, and something has to be done about that.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Tom Welly, the general manager of a local advertising firm. Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of dealing with the past. Here's Father Bacik.
Tom, you and I have had a lot of opportunities in the past to talk about the topic of time, and I'd like to continue that kind of discussion. Time sounds like a very theoretical kind of notion, and in the history of philosophy and theology, there's been a lot of debate about what time really means or what it is. But besides all of that theoretical debate, I think there is a lot of practical import to time. It has a whole lot to do with our lives and the way we structure our existence. I think that really the question of time is a religious question in many ways, because it forces us to go deeper into who we are, how we relate to people, how we deal with our past and our future and our present involvement in things. I've noticed that when I give workshops on the question of time or teach classes on it, that students or people will often remark that it forced them to think more deeply about questions than they usually do. And I think that religious questions always involve a business of interpreting life, interpreting the depth dimension of what is going on with us, trying to become more aware of who we are and how we fit into the large structure of things and what the deeper meanings are to our life. So in all these ways, I think that time, the question of time, is really a religious matter and will end up having a lot of practical kind of import. I find it to be a fascinating topic. I know you and I have talked about it many times in the past, and perhaps we can carry that on again now.
All right, fine. I think that the time problem, as individuals face it on a practical basis, is a scary problem. It's one that they don't quite know how to deal with, and they're not sure where to turn to. Perhaps by tying it more closely into the religious aspects of it, and by developing that sort of strength, it will help not only in the spiritual side, but on the practical side as well.
I like to think that that is true, and you're right, you do need an entree into the topic, because most people would just simply dismiss it and not end up thinking about it. Although we do have a good deal of time management literature available, and I know people in the business world become very interested in that, but I always think that it is at the level of attitude that the problem first has to be attacked. It's the question of fundamental outlook and interpretation of our life, our past and future and present that we need to begin. I think you could rearrange all the time elements in a business, for example, and get all kind of great techniques going. But if you didn't have proper attitudes towards time in the first place as an individual or as a group, that things are going to go amiss in one way or another. So let's begin to look at this. Let's zero in on one type of the problem that we have in relationship to time, and that would be in talking about the past. So often when we talk about time, we distinguish past, present, and future. And I think while all of those come together in a way and can't be totally separated, I do believe that it is possible for the purpose of analysis to do that. So I'd like to just try to keep our conversation limited to the question of the past, or at least to concentrate on that. And when I start thinking about the past, I guess that part of the problem that I see is that many people have trouble coming to terms with the past. And for many people, the past is very negative. I think of people who grew up in bad family situations and just as soon forget the whole thing. I think of people who have fights and arguments with friends or acquaintances, associates in the past, and would just as soon never think about that again. And I think of people who are scarred by their past, children, abused children, or people who grew up in terrible family situations, who had to deal with alcoholic parents and feel that in some way they've been hurt or scarred by those particular experiences. So in many ways, for many people, the past is negative, and something has to be done about that.
I agree with you. I know that in my own life, as I look back on it, I think if someone asked me what the single most important event that happened in your life that shaped the rest of the life, I would probably respond and say the fact that my dad died when I was 3 years old, because then that brought along a lot of not only different practical things relative to the family and that sort of thing, but it definitely had to influence the rest of my life in terms of the father as the guide, as the leader, as the person to look up to. And I remember particularly as a young person, I always felt cheated because of that. Sometime in my life I dealt with it, although I can't tell you when or where or how.
I think one of the big problems with that kind of situation, which is obviously so important, and I sense the personal character of that and the importance in your own life, and that I know that you have dealt with it and dealt with it well. What I run into is a lot of people who have similar kind of situations who cannot integrate it in any way. They, for example, end up being very angry over that kind of situation. We find people who are very resentful of the fact that they were deprived in some way in their childhood. Or we find people that just have a deep rage within them, as though fate has dealt them a bad hand, and as though somehow the gods have not been on their side. Life is perceived as unfair because of poor childhood experiences, for example, the death of a parent, or inability to get along with other children, and so on. And I think that it's when that anger takes over and there is that deep resentment, maybe often not faced, but just smoldering beneath the surface, that we really end up with a lot of difficulties in relationship to the past.
No question. I think it could not only it could direct almost one's whole life if you allowed it to. That you've got to be very cautious, because the past can, even though a negative thing in the past can still be interpreted as a positive thing in terms of how you deal with it and how it affects you. And on the contrary side, that a very positive thing in the past, you can react negatively to it.
Yes. Yeah, it is largely a matter of interpretation, isn't it? I often think that life is fairly common for us humans. So much of it we share with one another. The difference that often seems to be that some people are able to interpret it in a positive or hopeful way, and others do not. Of course, there are some people who live in such extreme situations and have such problems, it's hard to imagine that they achieve the hope and the positive interpretation. I know when I see that, I end up just being inspired and thinking, my God, it's amazing that people can do this. That becomes my God becomes a prayer, like God must be the source of this kind of power that we see in the world when people can interpret. But for people who live in a less restricted kind of way and have rather ordinary kinds of experiences, you do see that some end up interpreting almost entirely negatively, and others seem to be able to see the positive side of what goes on. I think this goes with personal life, too. It's not just what has happened to us in terms of external events or what fate has given us, but I think of our own decisions. One of the great problems with the past, of course, is guilt. That people end up being guilty, feeling guilty, often neurotically so, about past actions, as though there were no forgiveness for sins. I think the inability to forgive oneself very often is part of it. I will talk to people who say, well, yeah, my friends forgive me, and in some ways I think God has forgiven me, but I can't forgive myself. I can't forget this bad thing that happened. I can see this happening in smaller ways than probably most of us could relate to on a daily basis, where it's often the negative thing or the bad thing we did, the mistake, the failure, the sin, that dominates our attention. I think of good mothers who all day long are caring for their children. They're very patient and kind, and maybe once during the day they blew up, got mad, and yelled at the kids. And it would seem that sometimes it's that one time that will dominate the attention. When one goes to bed at night and examines one's conscience, it turns out that that's the thing that preoccupies one. I think you can look at that in so many things. A person at work doing a fairly good job and putting in a good effort might fail in one particular case, or one particular situation is inadequate or doesn't measure up, and it'll be that thing that sort of dominates our attention. There's an old phrase that things are good when everything is together, Latin phrase, and there's no sense in saying Latin phrases here, but that goodness comes from having everything together, and that evil results from one defect. And I think that kind of saying has messed up our minds on a lot of things. I think that it is not true that people are bad because of one defect, because one area of our lives is not integrated with the rest of our personality, or that there's one time during the day that we didn't handle things well. So we're dealing here with the problem of guilt, I think, when we talk about the past.
I know in my own business experience that when, particularly working with young people, and they are so concerned about making mistakes, that I try to tell them that if they aren't making mistakes, they aren't doing enough. And if I can once overcome in their minds the idea that to make a mistake is evil and bad, and oh my goodness, they're going to concentrate on that and lock into it. But on the contrary, the real key is what is accomplished, not what mistakes were made. I recall at one time a company that I worked for, the president of that company had a large drawing behind his desk which showed a turtle, and the concept of it was that the turtle only made progress with his neck sticking out. And there was something to be said for that. Visually, I've thought of it many times.
Being able to take the risk.
You've got to take the risk, and you've got to be prepared to make the mistake, because if you attempt to always be right, you won't accomplish anything. You have to really you have to reach that conclusion in your mind that you are in fact going to make mistakes, and that's fine, that's okay.
And that one can even see those positively, right? That I will learn precisely from those. I think in the religious setting, Tom, it reminds me of the experience in the Christian family movement of years ago, where couples would gather in their homes to discuss the scriptures and the meaning of the church's teachings and so on, and there was a priest present, but the priest was not allowed to say anything during a big part of the meeting. And it was up to the people to talk about these religious matters, and without fear of being wrong. That's what they would start out with talking, then they'd always look to the priest to say, is it all right, or am I making a mistake, or is this heretical or not? Meaning it was deviating from Orthodox doctrine. And I remember so often saying that you have to have the freedom to make those mistakes. And it was so interesting to see the growth in people at that time when they learned to trust their own experience and to say things about their faith, and not just look to the theologian or the authority figure, but to say, hey, I've got something to say, and if it's wrong, tough, we'll get it corrected later on. And if I've deviated from orthodoxy in some way, I can straighten it out. But the important thing was to risk talking about it, being willing to witness to the faith and to say it in one's own words, even though it might not be doctrinally pure or totally orthodox.
I have to recall that when I was in college, and this was a long time ago, in the 50s, and the Catholic Church was rather doctrine-oriented, and things were rather black and white in terms of interpretation. And I always found that the most rewarding conversations, where we learned the most, and in the theology classes that we took, this was at Catholic University, were when Catholics who understood the faith, or at least had a basic understanding of the faith, when they questioned, when they threw up the arguments, when they attempted to develop apologetic approaches to solutions and really developed strong arguments pro and con on the different subjects. It was the questioning that was so important. It wasn't necessarily the rightness or the wrongness. It was the fact they were questioning and thinking it through and developing their own solutions.
Yeah, and that's when the real learning occurs.
That's exactly when the learning occurred.
Yeah, right, and that's your idea of risk again. And so what we're saying is that some people, when they view the past or view their life, are not able to get that kind of positive view of mistakes and failures. But the mistakes and failures and sins weigh heavily, and sometimes there's an excessive and sort of almost neurotic kind of guilt connected with that. I would think that, Tom, as we begin to look for solutions to this problem of dealing with the past, that we would have to try to recover probably a more positive notion of time and of try to work out what I would call a proper memory in life. It seems to me that what we've got to learn to do is to integrate this past into our current experience and personality and character. I've got to be able to look at the past and see the good and the bad in it, to face directly up to the sinfulness and the inadequacy, and to be able to come to terms with that. I don't think that it means that I forget it, and I don't think that it means that I'm no longer a product of that past. I am. I mean, I have shaped my character by the decisions that I have made. Every one of us determines our personality by the choices we make on a daily basis. So it's in there. I can't pretend somehow that it's all good or perfect, but I can look at it honestly, try to get a hold of it, and to be able to accept that. I think self-acceptance here is probably a key in all of this. I have to be able to look at that past and say, that's me. My tendency is to look away from it, pretend like, no, I never did that, or I couldn't have messed up that completely or totally. But rather to be able to face that and to say, yes, that is me, and to bring it into my character or personality.
I've always liked the notion, which I think ties into that, of an individual saying to themselves, you know, you've done something wrong, they've admitted it, but what they're saying to themselves is, I myself am giving myself another chance. You know, I'm the judge, the jury, and I'm going to give myself another chance. I realize I've made a mistake, but I'm going to move forward.
That's good. Yeah, I guess the other way of saying that is that I learned to forgive myself.
Right.
That, and I think that seems crucial to this process of achieving a proper memory and integrating our past. And I think that really is a process that keeps going on as we grow in life. It's one thing when we think of childhood experiences and the way we related to parents, for example. Well, at the age of 18 and one moves away from home, perhaps, then one has to sort of rethink that relationship, and we try to integrate it. But then as maybe the person later on in life gets married and founds their own family, maybe there's another kind of relationship established with the parents. And so even after your parents die, I think that ability to deal with the past is still there. It's still needed. We still have to work at it. So I don't think we integrate our past once and for all on a given situation, but new experiences, new data, new steps forward in our own life cause us to rethink those relationships. And you can often see that happening. I see that happening with collegians in relationship to their parents. So as they're achieving more adulthood, thinking for themselves, they very often are trying to look back and say, hey, the way my parents treated me before is not a final way of doing it. No, I need to deal with them more in an adult fashion. I want them to listen to me or take my opinion seriously. I want to be able to talk to my father man to man, a young man will say. So that I think that this is part of this process, and that same person later on in life is probably going to have to redo that once more. I think that, Tom, that this proper memory includes as well having a good sense of the good in the past. So when I'm talking about bringing in the negative and integrating that, I think we need to resurrect the positive as well when we look at our lives, and to make sure that's big in our heads. I think that, for example, when people go to confession in our Catholic tradition, I often tell people that when they examine the past year or month, whatever it is they're looking over, that they ought to think of what was good, too. Think of the way they made advances in handling their problems, little faults that were overcome, good things when they were obedient or kind or responsible or prayed well, and not just to zero in on the negative things. And I think that not only could one do that in confession, but in our general assessment of our lives we could do that. We could look back at the times when we have acted virtuously as well as sinfully. And I think that will give us a better balance, because we're trying to integrate not just the negative things, but the positive as well, the good things.
I think that's a great idea. I would love to see that kind of response in a confessor-confessee relationship, that the good would be brought out along with the bad. That's personally never happened to me.
Oh, I
think that's great.
Yeah, I think that would be a big step forward. Yeah, and it represents a whole style of life, I think. I think that is definitely needed. And
I think more people would go to confession more often.
I think maybe that's true, yeah. And maybe come out of it with a healthier attitude, too. I think that one of the things that I sometimes tell people in that kind of situation where we're celebrating the sacrament of penance or reconciliation, as we call it today, is to encourage people to keep up the good work, too. To say, remember the good times, and now give people a boost to say, to continue that. Because one of our problems in life, it seems, is that we get tired of doing the good. Maybe because we've forgotten the rewards that come from it, or people haven't patted us on the back, or we haven't seen any clear results or satisfactions from it. So I think we need that kind of encouraging word. Tom, we're talking about the past, and there really are a lot of problems connected with establishing a healthy memory. I think part of it is in this business of getting our roots clear again, of knowing who we are and where we came from. I think this is a very healthy development today in terms of a renewed interest in ethnicity, ethnic backgrounds, family customs. I know in our own parish now people bring food to have it blessed on Holy Saturday, a resurrection of a custom of the Eastern European people, and I think it's a beautiful thing. Time of baptism, I'm often reminding families to start to establish customs with the children. For us to get back and remember our ancestors, the one who built things for us, the people who made this country great and who have given us the opportunity to live in freedom, the church people who have tried to create a better Christian community for us in the past, the people who educated us, our forefathers who have given us our very biological being, our parents who have sacrificed in many cases much for us. It seems to me that to be in touch with that helps to enrich our ability to live more effectively.
Yes, if the individual is not in touch with the past, it's almost impossible, in my opinion anyway, to really be with the present, because the past has shaped the individual. It's certainly true that as the individual develops and he looks back or she looks back over all of the developments of his life, they will find the things that will either enrich them or not enrich them, but they are certainly a product of the past. They have to look at it.
Yeah, we draw on that, and I think it's good to draw on it consciously, to know what's been put in there, and to be grateful for that. I think we really, it is a good trend that people are starting to think more in those terms. I think that in church circles we probably need to do that. We have to, as all of our church traditions are sort of checkered. There's a goodness and badness in them. None of us come out of a tradition that's just pure and lily white and has made no mistakes. So religiously, part of what we need to do is to be able to admit that and say, hey, there's weaknesses in my tradition. There's been sinfulness back there in my heritage. But there's also resources. There's also good things. There were saints, holy people, and people who made a contribution to the world, who lived charitably, and we stand on the shoulders of those people. We draw on that. And knowing who we are. Tom, I think it's good for us to remember that all of this talk of the past is for the sake of the present. What we're really trying to do is to live effective lives now. We want to be able to immerse ourselves in what is going on, to seize the many opportunities that are given to us in life. I often like to talk about that in terms of living wholeheartedly. To be a wholehearted person seems to me to be a beautiful kind of ideal. The heart is the symbol of the center of our being. It represents who I am, not just the feeling side of it, but the whole of my person. And when we think of the heart as that kind of symbol, and then to say, I want to be wholehearted, seems to me to be a beautiful kind of idea. What it suggests to me is that I'm working out of an energy source inside of me. I've got a center point that I feel integrated and confident out of, and that I'm able to deal well with other people. To be wholehearted suggests to me a person who is present to the situation, who pays attention when they're involved in conversation, who has their own needs enough under control so that they can empathize with other people. The wholehearted person is the opposite of the half-hearted person, who can't seem to gather their energy or strength or confidence in order to deal with life on its own terms, who are constantly absent from what is going on because they're preoccupied with other things. A lot of that preoccupation comes from guilt over the past, or frustration over one's fate, an inability to integrate that past. So we, Tom, have been talking about the past, but always in terms of the present and building for the future. We want to put forward here an ideal of a wholehearted person that's able to accept what has gone on, is able to forgive their own self. I liked your image of the turtle and sticking the neck out, able to risk and to see a positive side of the past. And I think then in this way we end up living as this wholehearted person, immersed in what is going on and able to seize the moment and make the most out of our opportunities.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, campus minister and assistant professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Tom Welly, the general manager of a local advertising firm. The topic of this week's Reflections was dealing with the past. If you have any questions about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network.